In the heart of the Persian desert, where the sun bleaches the earth white and the air shimmers with heat that could melt copper, there stands a dome of mud and straw that holds winter captive. It rises from the sand like a sleeping giant, its thick walls breathing slowly in the morning light, keeping secrets that modern engineers are only now beginning to understand. This is the story of Darius, though that was not always his name. In the city of Kerman, in the year we might call 1247, he was known simply as the Keeper of Winter, Yakhdar in the old tongue. His hands, weathered and careful, tended to something that should not have existed: ice, perfect and crystalline, preserved through the blazing months when even shadows provided no relief from heat. Before refrigerators hummed in kitchens, before electricity traced its web across continents, before the first ice ship ever left the frozen harbors of New England, there was Darius. And before Darius, there were others, generations of quiet craftsmen who understood that the earth itself could be convinced to hold winter, if you knew how to ask. Each morning, as the muezzin's call drifted across the city's flat rooftops and the bakers began their work in the pre-dawn darkness, Darius would walk the 100 paces from his small house to the yakhchal, the ice house that had been his charge for nearly 30 years. His sandaled feet knew every stone in the path, every slight depression where rainwater gathered during the brief winter storms that blessed this land so rarely. The dome loomed before him, 40 feet high and twice as wide, its surface the color of dried earth. To a stranger's eye, it might have seemed like nothing more than an overgrown pottery kiln, a monument to some forgotten purpose. But Darius could hear it breathing. He could feel the coolness that seeped from its walls even in the morning heat, the promise of winter that lived year-round in its shadowed heart. Today, like every day for the past 3 decades, he would enter this ancient miracle and tend to the ice that waited in its depths, ice that his grandfather had learned to harvest from the shallow pools that formed in the desert during winter's brief visit, ice that defied every law the blazing sun had written across this land. The story of the Persian ice houses is not a story of kings or conquests, of grand palaces or glittering treasures. It is a story of quiet mastery, of human beings who looked at the impossible and found it merely difficult. It is the story of a technology so elegant, so perfectly adapted to its environment, that modern engineers study it. Still, humbled by the wisdom embedded in walls of mud and straw. The shape of winter. The morning sun had not yet climbed high enough to begin its daily assault on the city when Darius reached the entrance to the yakhchal. The doorway was cut low into the northern face of the dome, barely tall enough for a man to enter without bending. This was not accident or poor planning. Every detail of the ice house had been considered and reconsidered across generations of builders, each measurement tested against the harsh mathematics of desert survival. Darius paused at the threshold, as he had every morning for 30 years, and placed his palm against the cool stone of the entrance. Even in summer, when the air outside could bake bread, the walls remained cool to the touch. His grandfather had taught him this ritual when he was still a boy, learning the mysteries of the Yakhdar, to feel for the health of the building, to sense any change in its ancient conversation with heat and cold. The dome behind him rose like a prayer made solid, its shape as carefully calculated as any astronomer's astrolabe. Not quite a perfect hemisphere, but something more subtle, a curve that shed heat like water, that channeled the desert wind in patterns learned over centuries of trial and error. The builders who had raised this particular yakhchal, 300 years before Darius was born, had understood something that would not be written in textbooks for another 1,000 years, that the physics of cooling were as much about the shape of space as the materials that defined it. Inside, the entrance tunnel stretched forward into darkness, sloping gently downward into the earth's cool embrace. Darius reached for the oil lamp that hung beside the door, its bronze surface green with age, and struck the flint with movements so practiced they seemed like breathing. The small flame bloomed to life, casting dancing shadows on walls that sweated coolness even in summer's grip. The tunnel was perhaps 20 paces long, designed to trap the outside air in its curves before it could reach the ice chamber beyond. Each turn was deliberate, each angle part of a grand strategy against heat. As Darius walked deeper into the earth, the temperature dropped with each step, the air growing thick and sweet with the metallic taste of winter. At the end of the tunnel, the space opened into a vast circular chamber that seemed to breathe with quiet life. Here, in the heart of the yakhchal, winter lived year-round. The dome soared overhead, lost in shadows that his small lamp could not reach, but Darius knew its shape by heart, a perfect arch that distributed weight and temperature with mathematical precision. The keepers of ancient knowledge. The chamber floor was paved with flat stones, fitted so tightly that no gap showed between them. In the center, a circular depression perhaps 30 feet across held the ice, blocks and chunks of crystalline winter that gleamed like jewels in the lamplight. Even now, in the 8th month of summer, when the outside air could kill an unprotected man, there was ice enough to fill a dozen carts. Ice that had been made not 6 months ago, when winter's brief touch graced the desert with pools of water that froze in the clear night air. Darius set his lamp in its accustomed niche and descended the stone steps that led down to the ice pit. The temperature here was cool enough to make his breath visible in small puffs, a summer miracle that never ceased to fill him with quiet wonder. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small brush made from palm fibers, worn smooth by decades of use, and began the day's first task, clearing away the thin film of moisture that had condensed on the ice overnight. This was the work that most people never saw, the daily devotion that kept winter alive in the heart of summer. Each piece of ice had to be individually tended, brushed clean of moisture that would otherwise slowly steal its substance away. The blocks nearest the walls, where the dome's thick structure held the coolest temperatures, could last for years if properly maintained. Those in the center of the pit required more frequent attention, their surfaces carefully cleaned and dried, to prevent the slow theft of heat that came with every breath of warmer air. As he worked, moving from block to block with the methodical patience of a gardener tending precious flowers, Darius thought of his grandfather Kaveh, who had first brought him to this chamber when he was barely 10 years old. The old man had been the yakhtar before him, and his father before that, stretching back through generations to the time when the first yakhchal had been built in Kerman. The ice remembers winter, his grandfather had told him that first day, his weathered hands showing the boy how to brush away moisture without disturbing the crystal structure beneath. Our job is to help it remember, to keep its memory clean and cold and perfect. The ice wants to return to water, to join the great cycle that carries it from cloud to rain to river to cloud again. But we ask it to wait, to stay frozen a little longer, to serve those who need its blessing. The old man had taught him that the yakhchal was more than a building, it was a conversation between human wisdom and natural law, a delicate negotiation with forces older than civilization. The dome above was not just shelter but a focusing lens for coolness, designed to gather every breath of cool air from the earth below and the night sky above. The walls, 3 feet thick and made from a special mixture of clay, sand, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash, were not just barriers, but active participants in the ancient alchemy of cooling. "Feel here," his grandfather had said, pressing the boy's small hand against the inner wall of the chamber. "The wall breathes. In the day, it drinks heat from the air and holds it in its thick belly. At night, when the desert grows cold, it breathes this heat out through the dome, carrying it up and away like smoke from a fire. The wall is always working, always fighting the sun, always keeping our winter safe." The mathematics of miracles. The science embedded in the yakhchal was elegant in its simplicity and profound in its sophistication. The dome's shape was no accident, its curve followed the mathematical relationship between surface area and volume that minimized heat absorption while maximizing structural strength. The thick walls were not merely insulation but thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it away during the cool desert nights. But it was the orientation that revealed the true genius of the builders. The yakhchal's entrance faced north, away from the sun's daily journey across the southern sky. The dome itself was angled to catch the cool northern winds that blew across the desert in winter, channeling them down through hidden vents into the chamber below. In summer, when these winds carried heat instead of coolness, the vents could be sealed with carefully fitted stones, turning the ice house into a sealed world that held winter captive. As Darius worked his way around the ice pit, he could feel the building's ancient systems at work around him. The walls sweated slightly in the morning warmth, condensation forming as the cool surface met the slightly warmer air that had entered with him. But this moisture did not drip onto the ice, instead, it was channeled away through tiny grooves carved into the stone, carrying its heat energy away from the precious winter stored below. The floor itself was a marvel of engineering. Beneath the fitted stones lay layers of crushed pottery, sand, and lime, a drainage system that wicked away any melted water before it could form pools that would speed the ice's return to liquid. Every drop of water that melted was carried away through hidden channels, emerging somewhere in the city's irrigation system to water gardens and fill cisterns. Above his head, invisible in the lamplit darkness, windcatchers built into the dome structure caught every breath of moving air and channeled it in patterns designed to maximize cooling. The ancient builders had understood something that modern engineers were only now rediscovering, that moving air could be shaped and directed like water, made to flow in currents that carried heat away from where it was not wanted. The city's frozen heart, Kerman itself, had grown around its ice houses. There were 7 yakhchals within the city walls, each serving a different quarter, each maintained by its own yakhdar and the families who had inherited this quiet calling. In the bazaar, when the summer heat made walking outdoors an ordeal of endurance, merchants would send their servants to the nearest ice house to purchase chips and blocks of winter for their most precious goods. The spice merchants relied on ice to keep their saffron and cardamom dry and potent through the humid season. The silk traders packed delicate fabrics with ice to prevent the desert heat from fading their colors. The physicians who served the wealthy families of the city prescribed ice for fevers and inflammation, believing, not incorrectly, that winter's touch could heal what summer had damaged. But the yakhchals served a purpose beyond commerce and medicine. They were proof that human ingenuity could prevail against even the harshest conditions that nature imposed. In a land where water was more precious than silver, where the summer sun could kill the unprepared, the ice houses stood as monuments to the possibility of abundance even in scarcity. The construction of a new yakhchal was an event that brought the entire city together. The work could not be done by ordinary builders, it required master craftsmen who understood the ancient secrets of thermal engineering, who knew how to mix the special mortar that would breathe with the desert's rhythm of heat and cold. The dome had to be raised in a single season, its curve mathematically perfect, its surface smooth enough to shed heat like water. The making of the mortar alone required the services of specialists who charged high prices for their knowledge. The eggs had to be fresh but not too fresh, their whites mixed with the clay and lime in proportions that had been tested across generations. The goat hair had to be of a particular length and texture, strong enough to bind the mixture but fine enough not to create weak points where cracks might form. The ash had to come from specific woods, burned at specific temperatures, ground to a powder that felt like silk between the fingers. When a new yakhchal was completed, the entire community would gather for its first winter, watching as the shallow pools that formed during the cold months were carefully harvested and carried into the new ice house. It was a ceremony of hope and practical magic, a celebration of the human ability to capture time itself and hold it prisoner for the benefit of future generations. The harvest of winter. The season of ice-making began with the first cold winds that swept down from the northern mountains, carrying with them the scent of snow and the promise of brief respite from the desert's eternal heat. For Darius, these were the most important weeks of the year, the time when winter's fleeting visit would be captured and preserved for the long months of blazing summer ahead. The process began before dawn, when the temperature dropped to its lowest point in the shallow pools that had been carefully prepared during the autumn months began their transformation into ice. These pools, called abanbars, were arranged in precise patterns around each yakhchal, their surfaces designed to maximize exposure to the cold night sky while remaining protected from the warming touch of the morning sun. Darius would wake in the deep darkness before dawn, his body attuned after decades to the subtle changes in temperature that marked the difference between a night that would make ice and one that would merely make the pools cold. The air had to be still, wind would prevent the water from forming the perfect sheets of ice that were needed. The sky had to be clear, clouds would hold the earth's warmth close and prevent the rapid cooling that turned water into winter. On the perfect nights, when all conditions aligned, Darius would dress in his thickest robes and make his way through the sleeping city to the pools that surrounded his yakhchal. Other yakhdars would be stirring too, their oil lamps creating small constellations of light in the pre-dawn darkness as each keeper tended to his own harvest of winter. The pools were shallow by design, no deeper than a man's thumb, their surfaces carefully leveled to ensure uniform freezing. Too deep, and the water would not freeze completely through. Too shallow, and the ice would be too thin to harvest efficiently. The bottoms were lined with clean sand and smooth stones, creating surfaces that would release the ice cleanly when morning came. By the time the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hint of dawn, the pools would be covered with sheets of ice thin as glass but perfect in their crystalline structure. This was the moment that required all of Darius's skill and experience. The ice had to be harvested quickly, before the sun's first rays could begin their daily work of destruction, but carefully enough to preserve every precious crystal. Working with tools that had been passed down through generations, thin bronze chisels, wooden scrapers, leather scoops that would not damage the ice's surface, Darius would carefully lift each sheet of ice from its pool and carry it into the protective embrace of the yakhchal. The ice rang like musical bells when it touched, creating a symphony of winter that echoed through the chamber as each harvest was stored away. The largest sheets went to the bottom of the ice pit, where they would form the foundation for the smaller pieces that would be added throughout the winter season. Each layer was carefully arranged to minimize air gaps while allowing for the circulation of the cool air that would keep the entire mass frozen. Salt water from the distant Persian Gulf was sometimes sprinkled between layers, not enough to make the ice taste salty, but sufficient to lower the freezing point and help the individual pieces bond into a solid mass that would resist melting. The science of preservation. The daily maintenance of the ice required a deep understanding of the physics of heat transfer that would not be formally described in scientific texts for many centuries to come. Darius had learned these principles not from books, for few existed in his time that described such practical matters, but from direct observation and the accumulated wisdom of generations of yakhchals. He knew, for instance, that ice lost its substance not only through melting but through sublimation, the direct transformation from solid to vapor that occurred whenever ice was exposed to moving air. This was why the ice had to be brushed clean each morning, to remove the thin film of condensed moisture that would otherwise accelerate this invisible theft of winter. He understood that the placement of each piece of ice within the chamber affected its longevity. Ice stored against the thick walls of the yakhchal, where the thermal mass was greatest and the temperature most stable, would last longer than ice placed in the center of the pit. But ice in the center was more accessible for daily use, more easily reached when customers came seeking winter's blessing for their needs. The management of this balance, between preservation and accessibility, between conservation and commerce, required a kind of three-dimensional chess playing that few modern engineers would appreciate. Every decision about where to place a new harvest, how to arrange the existing stores, which pieces to sell and which to preserve, had consequences that would echo through the long months of summer ahead. Darius had developed his own system over the years, a method of rotation and organization that his grandfather had never taught him but which he had discovered through careful observation and experimentation. He marked certain blocks with small notches that indicated when they had been harvested, keeping the oldest ice in circulation while allowing the newest additions time to settle and bond with their neighbors. The tools of his trade were few but perfectly adapted to their purpose. The palm fiber brushes that he used for cleaning were soft enough not to damage the ice's surface but firm enough to remove condensed moisture efficiently. The wooden scoops that he used for moving smaller pieces were carved from a particular type of desert hardwood that would not crack in the extreme temperature changes of the ice chamber. The bronze chisels that he used for breaking larger blocks into smaller pieces were shaped and weighted to deliver precise force without creating the fractures that would weaken the ice's structure. But perhaps his most important tool was his own knowledge, the accumulated understanding of how ice behaved in different conditions, how it responded to changes in temperature and humidity, how it could be coaxed to last longer or persuaded to give up its cooling power more efficiently. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It lived in his hands, in his eyes, in the subtle intuitions that told him when something was wrong with the delicate balance of forces that kept winter alive in summer's heart. The community of cold. The yakhchal was never merely a private enterprise. It was woven into the social and economic fabric of Kerman like a thread that strengthened the entire cloth. The ice that Darius preserved was not just a commodity, it was a shared resource that connected rich and poor, merchant and craftsman, physician and baker in a network of mutual dependence and support. The wealthy families of the city paid premium prices for the largest and clearest blocks of ice, which they used to cool their homes during the summer months and to preserve the delicate foods that marked their status. Blocks of ice would be placed in specially designed chambers within their houses, where they would slowly melt and provide hours of cooling relief from the desert heat. The water that resulted from this melting was not wasted, it was channeled into the houses' irrigation systems, where it helped maintain the gardens that were symbols of prosperity in this water-scarce land. The merchants who traded in perishable goods were among Darius's most reliable customers. Spice traders would pack their most valuable saffron and cardamom with chips of ice to preserve their potency during the long summer months when humidity could ruin an entire year's investment. Silk merchants would use ice to keep their fabrics cool and dry, preventing the sun from fading colors that had been carefully developed in distant workshops. Jewelers used ice to keep precious metals and stones at stable temperatures, preventing the expansion and contraction that could crack delicate settings. But the yakhchal served the common people as well, in ways that were more subtle but no less important. During the summer months, when illness struck hardest and the heat made cooking difficult, pieces of ice could be purchased for amounts that even the poor could afford. A small chip of ice, dissolved in water, could bring relief to a fever that might otherwise prove fatal. Ice added to bread dough would help it rise properly even in the summer heat, ensuring that the city's bakers could continue to feed their communities through the harshest months. The physicians of Kerman had developed an entire branch of medicine based on the therapeutic properties of ice. They prescribed it for inflammation, for digestive disorders, for the madness that sometimes struck people who had been too long in the sun. They mixed it with various herbs and spices to create cooling drinks that they believed could restore the body's natural balance of hot and cold humors. Whether these treatments were effective in medical terms, they certainly provided psychological relief to patients who associated the touch of winter with healing and hope. Children, especially, were drawn to the mystery of the yakhchals. On the hottest days of summer, when the air itself seemed to burn and the stones of the street were too hot to touch, small groups of children would gather near the entrances to the ice houses, hoping for a chance to glimpse the winter that lived inside. Darius, like most yakhdars, had a soft spot for these young visitors. He would sometimes allow well-behaved children to enter the chamber briefly, to experience the miracle of coolness in the heart of summer and to understand that the impossible was merely difficult if you had the right knowledge and patience. These visits served an important purpose beyond simple kindness. They were how the knowledge of the yakhchals was passed from generation to generation, how young people learned to respect and understand the ancient technology that made life in the desert not just possible but comfortable. Some of these children would grow up to become yakhdars themselves, inheriting the quiet calling of keeping winter alive in summer's realm. The rhythm of seasons. The yakhchal lived according to rhythms that were older than human memory, cycles that connected the ice house to the greater patterns of earth and sky, season and weather, that governed all life in the desert. Darius had learned to read these rhythms like a written language, to understand the subtle signs that told him when to prepare for a harsh summer or when to expect an early winter. In the autumn months, before the first ice could be made, the work focused on maintenance and preparation. The shallow pools had to be cleaned and releveled, their surfaces made perfectly smooth for the winter's harvest. The dome itself had to be inspected for cracks or damage, any problems repaired with the special mortar that would maintain the building's thermal integrity through another year of extremes. The windcatchers built into the dome structure had to be checked and adjusted, their movable panels set to catch the winter winds that would bring cooling air into the chamber below. The drainage channels that carried away melted water had to be cleared of any debris that might block their flow. The entrance tunnel had to be swept clean and its oil lamps refilled and trimmed. But the most important autumn work was the preparation of the yakhdar himself. The long months of summer work in the cool chamber had to be balanced by time spent in the heat, allowing his body to readjust to the extreme temperatures he would face during the ice harvest. He had to prepare his tools, sharpening chisels and replacing worn brushes, checking the leather of his scoops for cracks that might leak precious ice water. Winter was the season of harvest, but also the season of greatest risk. The brief weeks when ice could be made were the only opportunity to replenish the stores. That would have to last through the entire coming year. A winter that was too warm, or too windy, or too cloudy could spell disaster for the yakhchal and all who depended on its stores of preserved cold. Darius would spend these weeks in an almost constant state of vigilance, watching the sky for signs of changing weather, monitoring the temperature of the pools that would determine whether ice could be made or not. He would wake several times each night to check the conditions, to see if the still, clear, cold air that made perfect ice was developing or if wind and clouds were spoiling the night's potential. The actual harvest was a race against time. Once the sun rose above the eastern horizon, the temperature would begin to climb rapidly, and any ice left exposed would begin its transformation back to water, working in the pre-dawn darkness. By the light of oil lamps, Darius would have perhaps 2 hours to collect the night's harvest and store it safely in the protective depths of the yakhchal. Spring brought different challenges. As the weather warmed and the last opportunities for ice-making passed, the focus shifted to conservation and management of the stores that had been accumulated during the winter months. This was when Darius's skills as a preserver of winter were most severely tested. The ice had to be organized and maintained to ensure that it would last through the long, hot months ahead. The spring work also included the delicate business of opening the yakhchal to customers while maintaining the internal conditions that kept the ice frozen. Each time the entrance tunnel was opened, warm air would enter the chamber, and this had to be managed carefully to minimize the loss of cooling. Darius developed elaborate protocols for customer visits, timing them for the coolest parts of the day and limiting the number of people who could enter the chamber at any given time. The alchemy of cooling. The preservation of ice in desert conditions required an understanding of thermodynamics that would not be formally described by scientists for many centuries. But Darius and his fellow yakhchals understood these principles intuitively, through generations of careful observation and practical experimentation. They knew that ice lost its substance through 3 primary mechanisms: melting from contact with warm air or surfaces, sublimation into water vapor when exposed to moving air, and conduction when placed in contact with materials that conducted heat efficiently. Each of these threats required different strategies and countermeasures. Melting was fought through insulation and thermal mass. The thick walls of the yakhchal absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, creating a thermal buffer that protected the ice from the extremes of desert temperature. The chamber itself was designed to minimize air circulation except when specifically needed for cooling, creating a still environment where temperature remained as stable as possible. Sublimation was controlled through careful management of humidity and air movement. The daily brushing that Darius performed was designed not just to clean the ice but to remove the thin layer of water vapor that formed when ice sublimated in contact with slightly warmer air. The drainage channels built into the chamber floor wicked away any water that did form, preventing it from creating humid conditions that would accelerate sublimation. Heat conduction was minimized through the careful selection and arrangement of materials. The ice was never placed in direct contact with metal, which would conduct heat rapidly from the chamber walls. Instead, it rested on specially selected stones that had low thermal conductivity, or on beds of salt that actually helped to keep the ice frozen by lowering its melting point. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of yakhchal technology was the understanding of how different types of ice behaved under different conditions. Not all ice was the same. Ice that formed quickly in very cold conditions had a different crystal structure than ice that formed slowly in moderate cold. Ice that was harvested while still thin had different properties than ice that was allowed to thicken before collection. Darius had learned to recognize these differences and to use them strategically in organizing his stores. Quick frozen ice, with its small crystal structure, was more resistant to sublimation but more prone to melting. Slow frozen ice, with its larger crystals, would last longer in storage but was more susceptible to damage from handling. The arrangement of different types of ice within the chamber was a complex puzzle that had to account for these varying properties as well as the practicalities of access and customer needs. The yakhchals had also discovered that ice could be treated with various substances to improve its keeping qualities. Salt, as mentioned, could be used to lower the melting point and help blocks bond together. But other materials were also effective. Certain types of ash could be mixed with ice to absorb moisture and prevent sublimation. Sawdust from specific woods could provide insulation, while adding compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. Even certain spices were sometimes used, not for their flavor but for their preservative properties. The economics of impossibility. The yakhchal operated according to economic principles that were as complex as its thermodynamics. The ice that Darius preserved was simultaneously abundant and scarce, cheap to produce but expensive to maintain, essential for survival yet accessible only to those who could afford its cost. The basic economics were straightforward enough. During the brief winter season, when conditions allowed for ice production, the cost of making ice was minimal, essentially the cost of Darius's labor in harvesting and storing the frozen water that nature provided free. But maintaining this ice through the long summer months required constant attention and care, creating ongoing costs that had to be recovered through sales. The pricing structure that had evolved reflected these realities. Fresh ice, harvested within the past few weeks, commanded premium prices because of its superior quality and longer remaining storage life. Older ice, which had been in storage for months and was beginning to show signs of age, was sold at lower prices to customers who needed immediate cooling but could afford to pay less. The largest and clearest blocks of ice were reserved for the wealthiest customers, who paid not just for the ice itself but for its aesthetic qualities. These perfect blocks, clear as glass and solid as stone, were status symbols as much as practical cooling devices. They would be displayed in the homes of the wealthy, where their slow melting would provide both cooling and a demonstration of the family's prosperity. But the yakhchal also served a crucial social function by making smaller quantities of ice available to the poor and middle classes. Chips and fragments that were removed during the daily maintenance could be sold at very low prices, allowing even the poorest families to afford a small taste of winter's blessing during the hottest days of summer. This ensured that the benefits of the ancient technology were shared throughout the community, not just hoarded by the wealthy. The yakhdar himself occupied a unique position in this economic system. He was neither wealthy nor poor, neither merchant nor craftsman, but something in between, a guardian of ancient knowledge whose specialized skills were essential to the community's survival but whose work was so specialized that few understood its true complexity. Darius owned neither the yakhchal nor the ice it contained. The building itself belonged to a wealthy family that had inherited it from ancestors who had commissioned its construction centuries earlier. The ice belonged to whoever had paid for its harvest and storage. Darius was paid a salary for his services as keeper, plus a small percentage of the profits from ice sales. It was enough to live comfortably but not enough to make him wealthy, a reflection of the fact that his value to the community lay not in the accumulation of wealth but in the preservation of knowledge and the maintenance of an essential service. The business relationships that surrounded the yakhchal were complex webs of mutual dependence and obligation. The spice merchants who relied on ice for preservation would often pay in advance for their summer needs, providing capital that could be used to maintain the ice house during the expensive months of storage. The wealthy families who used ice for comfort would sometimes contribute to the costs of repairs and maintenance, understanding that their luxury depended on the continued operation of the ancient technology. But perhaps the most important economic relationship was the one between the yakhdar and the community of craftsmen who understood the specialized knowledge required to build and maintain the ice houses. The mortar makers, the stone cutters, the bronze workers who made the tools, the woodworkers who carved the scoops, all of these specialized trades were connected to the yakhchal and depended on its continued operation for their livelihood. When a yakhchal required major repairs or when a new ice house was to be constructed, these craftsmen would come together in a collaboration that resembled nothing so much as the building of a cathedral, a long-term project that required the coordination of many different skills and the patient accumulation of materials and knowledge over many seasons. The apprenticeship of winter. The knowledge that kept the yakhchals operating was never written down in books or formal treatises. It lived in the hands and minds of the yakhdars themselves, passed from master to apprentice in a tradition that stretched back through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. For Darius, the transmission of this knowledge to the next generation was perhaps the most important part of his calling. His current apprentice was a young man named Rostam, the son of a carpet weaver who had shown an unusual aptitude for understanding the subtle rhythms of temperature and humidity that governed the ice house's operation. Rostam had been coming to the yakhchal for 3 years now, first as a curious child who was allowed to observe the daily routines, then as a serious student who was trusted with simple tasks like cleaning tools and organizing storage areas. The apprenticeship followed ancient patterns that had been established when the first ice houses were built. The student began by learning to see, to observe the ice and understand how different pieces behaved under different conditions, to recognize the signs that indicated when ice was healthy and when it was beginning to deteriorate. This phase could last for years, as the apprentice learned to read the subtle visual cues that revealed the ice's condition. Next came the development of touch, learning to feel the difference between ice that was solid throughout and ice that had developed internal weaknesses, between ice that was properly dry and ice that was beginning to accumulate surface moisture. The hands of a skilled yakhchal were as sensitive as those of a physician, capable of diagnosing problems through the lightest contact. The apprentice also had to learn the rhythms of the seasons and the patterns of weather that determined when ice could be made and when it could not. This required not just memorization but deep understanding, the ability to read the sky and the wind and the temperature and predict how these factors would interact to create the conditions needed for successful ice production. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of the apprenticeship was learning the art of patience. The work of the yakhchal was fundamentally about waiting for the right conditions to make ice, waiting for ice to form properly, waiting for the slow processes of preservation to do their work. In a culture that valued swift action and dramatic gestures, the yakhchal had to learn to find satisfaction in quiet persistence and subtle mastery. Rostam was proving to be an exceptional student. He had developed an intuitive understanding of the ice house's thermal dynamics that had taken Darius many years to acquire. He could predict changes in the ice's condition before they became visible, and he had suggested several small improvements to the daily maintenance routine that had proved both practical and effective. But more importantly, Rostam had demonstrated the character traits that were essential for a yakhchal. He was naturally patient and methodical, willing to spend hours on detailed work that others might find boring. He was observant and thoughtful, quick to notice changes in conditions but careful not to act hastily. He was respectful of the ancient knowledge that had been passed down through generations but also creative enough to find new solutions to old problems. The formal transfer of responsibility from master to apprentice was still several years away. Rostam would need to demonstrate his competence through at least 3 complete cycles of seasons, proving that he could handle the yakhchals operation through the full range of conditions and challenges that each year brought. He would need to show that he could maintain the ice stores through a particularly difficult summer, that he could maximize the harvest during a productive winter, and that he could manage the complex relationships with customers and suppliers that kept the ice house economically viable. But already, Darius could see that the ancient knowledge would be preserved for another generation. The traditions that had been passed down from his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather before him would continue to live and grow in the hands of this capable young man. The conversation between human wisdom and natural law that was embodied in the yakhchal would continue, adapting to new challenges and opportunities while maintaining its essential character. The network of ice Kerman was not unique in its mastery of ice preservation. Throughout the Persian Empire and beyond, similar technologies had developed wherever the climate and geography made them feasible. The yakhchals of different regions had evolved their own particular adaptations to local conditions, creating a network of related but distinct approaches to the ancient challenge of keeping winter alive in summer's realm. In the great city of Isfahan, the ice houses were built with different proportions and orientations to account for the different patterns of wind and sun that characterized that region's climate. The dome shapes were more elongated, designed to shed the particular type of wind-driven sand that was common in Isfahan's desert environment. The internal organization was different too, with multiple smaller chambers instead of the single large chamber that characterized Kerman's design. In the mountain cities to the north, where winter came earlier and lasted longer, the yakhchals were designed to take advantage of natural ice formation in mountain streams and lakes. These ice houses were often built partially underground, taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulation to maintain cooler temperatures year-round. The harvesting techniques were different too, involving the cutting of large blocks from natural ice formations rather than the careful collection of thin sheets from artificial pools. But perhaps the most sophisticated yakhchal network was found in the great city of Yazd, where the desert conditions were even more extreme than those of Kerman. The Yazdi ice houses were marvels of engineering that incorporated wind-catching towers and underground channels that connected multiple buildings in a system designed to maximize cooling efficiency. The yakhchals of Yazd had developed techniques for preserving ice that were so advanced that they could maintain frozen stores for 2 full years, allowing them to survive even the occasional winter when conditions prevented new ice production. The different regional approaches to ice preservation created opportunities for trade and knowledge exchange that enriched the entire tradition. Yakhchals from different cities would sometimes travel to observe each other's techniques, sharing innovations and learning new approaches to common problems. Young apprentices would occasionally spend time studying in distant cities, bringing new ideas back to their home regions while also spreading their own traditions to new places. This network of knowledge and practice created a kind of technological ecosystem that was remarkably robust and adaptive. When local conditions changed, due to shifts in climate, changes in water availability, or other environmental factors, the network of yakhchals could draw on the collective experience of many different regions to develop new solutions. Innovations that proved successful in one location could spread rapidly throughout the network, while approaches that proved problematic could be quickly abandoned in favor of better alternatives. The economic connections between different icehouse networks were as important as the technological ones. During particularly harsh summers, when one region's ice stores might be running low, it was sometimes possible to arrange for ice to be transported from regions where conditions had been more favorable. These long-distance ice trades were expensive and logistically challenging, but they provided a crucial backup system that helped ensure that no community would be left completely without access to cooling during the most extreme weather conditions. The transport of ice across desert distances was itself a specialized craft that required knowledge and skills that were closely related to those of the yakhchal. The ice had to be packed in special containers that provided insulation while allowing for the drainage of meltwater. The timing of travel had to be carefully planned to take advantage of the coolest parts of the day and the most favorable weather conditions. The routes had to be chosen to minimize the time spent in the harshest desert conditions while ensuring access to water and shelter for the transport teams. The long summer's test. As the summer months deepened and the heat became a living thing that pressed against the walls of the yakhchal with increasing intensity, Darius found himself entering the most critical phase of his yearly cycle. The ice that had been carefully harvested during the brief winter months was now his only weapon against the sun's relentless assault, and every decision he made about its management would determine whether his stores would last until the next winter's harvest. This particular summer was proving to be especially challenging. The heat had come early and with unusual intensity, and the meteorological signs that Darius had learned to read over his decades of experience suggested that it would be a long, brutal season. The wind patterns were wrong. Instead of the occasional cooling breezes that usually provided some relief, the air movement was carrying heat from the southern deserts, making even the night hours uncomfortably warm. Inside the yakhchal, the ancient systems were working as they had been designed to work, but they were being pushed to their limits. The thick walls were absorbing heat during the day and radiating it away at night, but the night temperatures were so high that the cooling process was less efficient than usual. The drainage system was working overtime to carry away the increased amount of meltwater that was resulting from the elevated ambient temperatures. Darius had responded to these challenging conditions by adjusting his maintenance routines and implementing emergency conservation measures that his grandfather had taught him but which he had never needed to use. He had increased the frequency of his ice brushing sessions, removing moisture buildup twice daily instead of the usual once. He had rearranged the ice stores to concentrate the most vulnerable pieces in the coolest parts of the chamber, sacrificing easy access for improved preservation. Most dramatically, he had implemented what yakhchals called the winter sleep, a process of sealing the yakhchal as completely as possible to prevent any outside air from entering the chamber. This meant that customers could only access ice during brief, carefully scheduled periods early in the morning when the outside temperature was at its lowest. It was an inconvenience for the community, but it was necessary to ensure that ice would remain available throughout the long summer months. The winter sleep also meant that Darius himself spent much of each day sealed inside the cool chamber, emerging only during the coolest hours of early morning and late evening. It was a strange, isolated existence that required a particular kind of mental discipline. In the artificial winter of the ice chamber, surrounded by the breathing walls and the steady whisper of evaporating moisture, time seemed to move differently. Days and weeks blended together into a continuous present, focused entirely on the quiet work of preservation. But this isolation also provided opportunities for the deep observation and contemplation that were at the heart of the yakhtar's art. Sealed inside the chamber with his stores of ice, Darius could study the subtle changes in the ice's behavior as the external conditions varied. He could observe how different pieces responded to the stress of extreme heat, which arrangements proved most stable, which conservation techniques were most effective under these challenging conditions. The wisdom of thermal patience. During these long summer days, when the outside world became almost uninhabitable and even the shadows provided no relief from heat, Darius often found his thoughts turning to the deeper lessons that the yakhchal had taught him over the decades of his service. The ice house was more than a building or a technology, it was a philosophy of patience and persistence made manifest in mud and stone. The central lesson of the yakhchal was that time itself could be captured and preserved, that moments of abundance could be stored against times of scarcity. But this preservation required constant attention and care, daily devotion to the small tasks that maintained the delicate balance between preservation and decay. It was a lesson that applied to much more than ice, to knowledge, to relationships, to the traditions and customs that held communities together across the generations. Darius had come to understand that his role as yakhtar was not just about maintaining a supply of ice for the community's practical needs, but about maintaining a connection to the ancient wisdom that the ice house represented. The yakhchal embodied centuries of accumulated knowledge about how human beings could work with natural forces rather than against them, how careful observation and patient experimentation could lead to solutions that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of physics. The dome that arched overhead in the cool chamber was a monument to human ingenuity, but it was also a lesson in humility. Its builders had not tried to overpower the desert's heat through brute force or complex machinery. Instead, they had studied the patterns of heat and cold, wind and stillness, day and night, and had found ways to work with these patterns to achieve their goals. The yakhchal succeeded not by fighting nature but by understanding it so deeply that natural forces could be persuaded to serve human purposes. This approach required a fundamentally different way of thinking than the one that was becoming more common in the world beyond Kerman. In the great cities to the west, Darius had heard, engineers and architects were beginning to develop technologies that relied on force and complexity rather than patience and understanding. They were building machines that could overcome natural limitations through the application of power, creating artificial environments that existed in opposition to the natural world rather than in harmony with it. The yakhchal represented an alternative philosophy, one that achieved remarkable results through careful attention to natural principles rather than through opposition to them. It was a technology that worked with the desert rather than against it, that used the Earth's own cooling capacity and the sky's own heat-radiating properties to create artificial winter in the heart of summer. But maintaining this ancient technology required more than just technical knowledge, it required a particular kind of character and commitment that was becoming increasingly rare. The work of the yakhtar demanded patience in a world that was increasingly impatient, attention to detail in an age that was beginning to value speed over precision, long-term thinking in a culture that was becoming more focused on immediate results. The seasons of memory. As Darius moved through the familiar routines of ice maintenance during the long summer days, he found himself remembering the countless other summers he had spent in this same chamber, tending to ice that had been harvested in winters that now seemed like distant dreams. Each summer had brought its own challenges and lessons, its own moments of crisis and triumph, its own particular configuration of weather and circumstances that had tested his skills and knowledge in different ways. He remembered the terrible summer of his 5th year as yakhtar, when an unusual weather pattern had brought humidity from the distant ocean and threatened to accelerate the ice's sublimation beyond anything his stores could survive. He had worked for days without sleep, implementing desperate conservation measures and experimenting with new techniques for moisture control, finally discovering that certain combinations of salt and ash could be used to absorb the excess humidity and preserve the ice's integrity. He remembered the miraculous summer of his 15th year, when an unexpected volcanic eruption far to the west had filled the atmosphere with dust that blocked some of the sun's heat and created the coolest summer in living memory. The ice had lasted so well that year that he had been able to maintain significant stores well into the following winter, providing a buffer that had made the next year's harvest less critical. He remembered the heartbreaking summer of his 22nd year, when a structural failure in the dome had allowed heat to penetrate the chamber and threatened to destroy the entire season's stores. Working with master builders and craftsmen from across the region, he had managed to effect emergency repairs while maintaining enough ice to serve the community's most essential needs, but it had been a close call that had taught him valuable lessons about early detection of structural problems. Each of these memories was also a lesson, a piece of accumulated wisdom that informed his current decisions and would be passed on to young Rostam when the time came for the knowledge to transfer to another generation. The art of the yakhtar was not just about the technical skills of ice preservation, but about the development of judgment and intuition that could only come through years of experience and careful observation. But perhaps the most important thing that Darius had learned over his decades of service was that the yakhchal was not just a repository for ice, but a repository for time itself. Each block of frozen water contained within it a moment from the past. A specific night when the conditions had been perfect for ice formation, a particular configuration of wind and temperature and humidity that had existed briefly and then passed away forever. In preserving the ice, he was preserving these moments, keeping them alive and available for the future when they would be needed. The ice that a sick child used to cool a fever in the height of summer contained within it the memory of a clear, cold night in winter when the stars had been brilliant and the air had been still and perfect. The ice that a merchant used to preserve his spices carried with it the essence of winter's blessing, the promise that abundance could be saved against times of scarcity. The teaching of apprentices. With the summer's heat intensifying and the conservation measures requiring more complex and precise execution, Darius found himself relying more heavily on Rostam's assistance. The young man had proven himself capable of understanding not just the techniques of ice preservation but the underlying principles that guided their application. He could read the signs that indicated when ice was beginning to deteriorate, and he had developed an intuitive sense for the timing and sequencing of maintenance tasks that allowed him to work efficiently even under the challenging conditions of the winter sleep. But more importantly, Rostam was beginning to understand the philosophical dimensions of the yakhtar's calling. He had observed that the icehouse operated according to principles that went beyond mere technical expertise, that the successful preservation of winter required a particular way of being in the world that emphasized patience, attention, and respect for natural processes. The teaching relationship between master and apprentice was itself a kind of preservation, the passage of knowledge and wisdom from one generation to the next that ensured the continuity of the ancient tradition. But unlike the preservation of ice, which required constant active intervention to prevent decay, the preservation of knowledge required a different approach, one that emphasized understanding over memorization, principle over procedure, wisdom over mere technique. Darius had learned from his grandfather that the most important knowledge could not be transmitted through direct instruction but had to be discovered through experience and reflection. The apprentice had to learn to see for himself, to develop his own understanding of the patterns and principles that governed the icehouse's operation. The master's role was not to provide all the answers but to ask the right questions, to create opportunities for learning, and to provide guidance when the apprentice's own discoveries led him astray. During the long summer days when they worked together in the cool chamber, Darius would often pose problems and scenarios for Rostam to consider. What would you do if the ice stores were running low and winter was still months away? How would you modify the maintenance routine if the summer were unusually humid? What signs would tell you that the dome structure was developing problems that might threaten the chamber's thermal integrity? These questions were not just tests of technical knowledge but invitations to think deeply about the principles that guided the yakhtar's work. The correct answers were less important than the process of thinking through the problems, of considering all the relevant factors and their interactions, of developing the kind of systematic approach to problem solving that would serve the apprentice well. when he faced challenges that no master had ever encountered. Rostam was proving to be a thoughtful and creative student. He would often spend hours considering a single question, examining it from multiple angles and thinking through the implications of different possible responses. He was beginning to develop the kind of intellectual independence that was essential for a yakhtar, the ability to think clearly and calmly even when facing unfamiliar or unprecedented situations. But perhaps the most encouraging sign of Rostam's development was his growing appreciation for the deeper significance of the work they were doing. He understood that the yakhchal was not just a business or a craft but a sacred trust, a responsibility to preserve and transmit knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries and that would be needed by generations yet to come. The community's dependence. As the summer reached its peak intensity and the heat became truly dangerous for those who had to work outdoors, the yakhchal's role in the community's survival became more evident than ever. The ice that Darius and Rostam preserved was not a luxury but a necessity, essential for the health and well-being of everyone in Kerman, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest laborer. The physicians of the city had come to rely completely on ice for their practice during the summer months. Without it, they would have no effective treatment for the heat-related illnesses that struck down dozens of people each year, no way to preserve the medicines that spoiled quickly in the extreme temperatures, no means of providing the cooling relief that often meant the difference between life and death for their patients. The merchants who traded in perishable goods had learned to organize their entire business practices around the availability of ice from the yakhchals. Caravan schedules were planned to take advantage of ice availability, storage facilities were designed to work with ice-based cooling systems, and trading partnerships were built around shared access to ice supplies. Without the ice houses, much of the city's commerce would have been impossible during the summer months. But perhaps the most important community dependence was less visible and more fundamental. The yakhchal represented proof that human ingenuity could prevail against even the harshest natural conditions, that careful planning and patient work could create abundance even in the midst of scarcity. In a land where survival often seemed to depend on luck and the mercy of natural forces, the ice house stood as a monument to the possibility of human agency and control. The psychological impact of this demonstration was as important as its practical benefits. Knowing that winter could be preserved and stored gave the community a sense of security and confidence that influenced every aspect of life during the difficult summer months. People could plan for the future, invest in long-term projects, and maintain hope during the worst heat waves because they knew that human wisdom and skill could create solutions to seemingly impossible problems. This sense of security was particularly important for the children and young people of the community, who were learning through the example of the yakhchal that challenges could be overcome through knowledge, patience, and careful work. The ice house was a school for problem-solving and long-term thinking, a demonstration that complex problems could be solved through the application of accumulated wisdom and systematic effort. But the community's dependence on the yakhchal also created responsibilities and obligations that extended far beyond the simple provision of ice. Darius understood that he was not just preserving frozen water but maintaining a complex system of relationships and expectations that connected him to every other member of the community. His work affected the health of the sick, the prosperity of merchants, the comfort of the wealthy, and the survival of the poor. This sense of responsibility was both a burden and a source of meaning. The knowledge that his daily work mattered to so many people gave purpose and significance to even the most routine tasks. The careful brushing of ice, the patient monitoring of temperature and humidity, the meticulous maintenance of equipment, all of these seemingly small actions were part of a larger effort to preserve and protect the community's well-being. The endurance of ancient wisdom. As the summer slowly began to wane and the first hints of autumn appeared in the evening sky, Darius reflected on the remarkable persistence of the technology he had devoted his life to maintaining. The yakhchal that surrounded him had been built more than 3 centuries earlier, and yet it continued to function as effectively as it had on the day of its completion. The techniques and knowledge that he used in his daily work had been passed down through more generations than anyone could count, and yet they remained as relevant and effective as they had ever been. This persistence was not accidental but was built into the very nature of the technology itself. The yakhchal worked not through the application of external power or complex mechanisms that could break down or become obsolete, but through the careful arrangement of simple materials and the patient application of well-understood principles. It was a technology that grew stronger and more refined over time rather than weaker and more vulnerable. Each generation of yakhchals had added to the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that made the ice houses work. Small improvements in technique, subtle refinements in procedure, new understanding of the principles that governed thermal dynamics, all of these contributions had been preserved and transmitted to future generations, creating a body of knowledge that was both ancient and constantly evolving. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the yakhchal tradition was its adaptability. While the fundamental principles remained constant, the specific applications and techniques could be modified to meet changing conditions and circumstances. When the climate shifted or new materials became available or different customer needs emerged, the tradition could adapt and evolve while maintaining its essential character and effectiveness. This adaptability was possible because the tradition was based on deep understanding of principles rather than rigid adherence to specific procedures. The yakhchals understood not just what to do but why it worked, which meant that they could modify their methods when circumstances required it while still achieving their fundamental goals. Darius could see this adaptability in his own work with young Rostam. The apprentice was learning the traditional techniques and procedures, but he was also encouraged to think independently and to develop new approaches when the situation warranted it. Some of Rostam's innovations had already proved useful and would likely be adopted by future generations of yakhchals, becoming part of the evolving tradition of ice preservation. The continuation of this ancient tradition into an uncertain future required not just the preservation of specific techniques but the cultivation of the particular kind of thinking and character that made innovation within tradition possible. The yakhchal had to be both conservative and creative, respectful of ancient wisdom and willing to adapt when circumstances required change. As the seasons turned and the years passed, the yakhchal continued its ancient rhythm of preservation and service. Darius grew older and eventually passed his responsibilities to Rostam, who in turn trained his own apprentice and added his own discoveries to the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. The ice house stood through changes in dynasty and religion, through wars and famines, through the rise and fall of empires that had seemed permanent in their time. The knowledge embedded in the yakhchal's walls proved more durable than the kingdoms that had commissioned its construction. The principles of thermal dynamics that governed its operation remained constant even as the understanding of these principles evolved and deepened. The patient work of preservation continued even as the world around it transformed in ways that the original builders could never have imagined. Centuries later, when other technologies had made the preservation of ice seem simple and commonplace, scholars and engineers would study the remains of the ancient yakhchals with wonder and respect. They would marvel at the sophistication of the thermal engineering, the elegance of the solutions to complex problems, the remarkable efficiency of systems that achieved their goals through the careful application of natural principles rather than the brute force of mechanical power. But perhaps the most important legacy of the yakhchal tradition was not its technical achievements but its demonstration of what human patience and wisdom could accomplish. In an age that increasingly valued speed over sustainability, power over elegance, complexity over simplicity, the ice houses stood as monuments to a different approach to problem solving, one that emphasized working with natural forces rather than against them, understanding rather than control, patience rather than haste. The story of Darius and his yakhchal is the story of countless quiet lives that have preserved and transmitted the wisdom of the past to the benefit of the future. It is the story of human beings who found meaning and purpose in the patient work of preservation, who understood that the most important achievements are often the ones that go unnoticed, who knew that true mastery lies not in dramatic gestures, but in the steady application of knowledge and skill to the challenges of daily life. In the cool darkness of the ancient ice chamber, surrounded by the breathing walls and the whisper of evaporating moisture, winter sleeps through the blazing heat of summer. The ice waits, patient and crystalline, holding within its frozen structure the memory of clear, cold nights when the stars were brilliant and the air was still and perfect. It waits to serve those who need its blessing, to provide cooling relief from heat that would otherwise be unbearable, to demonstrate once again that human wisdom and natural law can work together to create abundance. even in the midst of scarcity. And in this waiting, in this patient preservation of winter's essence through summer's trial, there is a lesson that transcends the particular circumstances of desert life in ancient Persia. It is a lesson about the power of persistence, about the value of quiet dedication, about the importance of preserving what is precious even when its value is not immediately apparent. It is a lesson about working with, rather than against the forces that shape our world, about finding elegant solutions to complex problems, about the patient accumulation of wisdom across generations. The yakhchal reminds us that the most sophisticated technologies are not always the most complex, that the most effective solutions are often the most simple, that the most enduring achievements are often the result of patient work rather than dramatic innovation. In an age of rapid change and constant noise, the ice house offers the gift of silence and stillness, the blessing of coolness in the heart of heat, the promise that winter's memory can survive even the longest summer. As the stars trace their ancient paths above the sleeping city, as the desert wind carries the scent of distant mountains and the promise of seasonal change, the ice waits in its chamber of mud and straw. It waits for morning and the yakhtar's gentle touch, for customers who will carry winter's blessing into their daily lives, for the continuing conversation between human need and natural abundance that has sustained life in this harsh land for countless generations. And now, as the last oil lamp flickers in the silence of the chamber, as the cool walls breathe slowly in the darkness, as the ice dreams its crystalline dreams of winter nights and starlit skies, may you find rest beside these stories of quiet lives and patient work. May your own dreams be touched by the coolness of ancient wisdom, by the peace of preservation, by the gentle rhythm of seasons turning and returning in their eternal dance. Let your eyes grow heavy with the weight of winter's blessing, let your thoughts drift like morning mist over the desert pools where ice once formed in silence and perfection. Sleep now, and dream of patient hands tending impossible things, of wisdom preserved in walls of clay and straw, of winter sleeping safely through summer's trial, waiting for its time to wake and serve once more. The yakhchal stands guard through the night, its ancient walls breathing slowly, its frozen heart beating with the rhythm of preserved time. In its patient endurance, in its quiet service, in its demonstration that the impossible is merely difficult when approached with wisdom and care, it offers the gentlest of invitations to rest, to dream, to find peace in the knowledge that human dedication can preserve what is precious through even the harshest trials. Sleep well, and let winter's memory cool your dreams.